Hey, it's Jordan. I'm delighted to be joined by Carly Tunno. You're a resident in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, about 7 miles from where Norfolk Southern detonated unnecessarily. Over 1 million pounds of toxic chemicals, including vinyl chloride, about 19 months ago now. You've had health effects, which we're going to get to. Also joining me is Dr. George Thompson, renowned toxicologist, 55 years of experience. He's done work in government, the private sector, and many other industries, and has also come out of retirement specifically over this chemical disaster in East Palestine and Western Pennsylvania. And through his analysis, seems much more far-reaching than just Ohio and Pennsylvania. We're having you because the EPA is just kind of the gift that keeps giving. Apparently, they provided information to you, Carly, that I'm not sure they ever made public. I have reached out to them, but they have not responded. And the information, to my untrained eye, seemed kind of questionable, but after talking to George, is pretty alarming as far as what was detected. Not recently, we're talking like this was in December 2023, they gave you this information. So at least half a year ago, they detected pretty high levels of dioxins, which are in some of their forms, the most toxic chemicals, period, on Earth. And from what I could tell, just buried it. Before we get to George, Carly, for people that haven't seen you yet, tell people your story. I interviewed you in person, but obviously very quickly after the derailment and detonation in February of 2023, you started having symptoms.
Right. Yes. So even before they vented and burned, I was experiencing, lightheadedness and dizziness. And then the week after the vent and burn, I had gotten sick where I vomited for days, unlike anything I've ever had in my lifetime. And shortly about the end of March, my hair had started to fall out and break off and become really brittle and change texture. And it's just, to the point where I had shaved my head because there was only a little patch left on the top of my head at that point. And I still have not gotten any answers onto why my hair fell out. Doctors are not giving me any advice besides just referrals to another doctor, which is just frustrating to the point where I've just, given up on chasing doctors to help me, essentially. But everybody in my house had experienced one health symptom or another, but I feel like I've experienced the most out of my household.
And I mean, you're not an elderly woman. You're young. You have mentioned to me that there are other women kind of in your area that have had this hair loss.
Yeah, I'm one of 6 women now that I know of. Since our last interview, one more woman had reached out to me and said that she was losing her hair as well. So one of 6 that I know of that have had problems with just their hair, let alone any other issues.
Mm-hmm. And remind me, how quickly did this start happening? The derailment was in February. Obviously, you had those other symptoms, but when did you start to notice your hair was receding?
My hair had started to fall out by the end of March of 2023. By April, I had asked the EPA about it and just kind of gone back and forth with them about whether or not it could possibly be related. And they just kind of dismissed me and told me I should see my own physician. But yeah, so within 2 months, my hair had started to fall out.
Well, so George, why I wanted you on is Carly spoke with the EPA last year. So this email I have is from December of 2023. Mark Durno, who is kind of the EPA's kind of on-scene coordinator here, he emailed her basically giving her a link to testing that they did. He described it as a public right of way that was tested in her area in Pennsylvania. And he said that, quote, the toxic equivalency values were 480 parts per trillion in shallow soil, 0 to 1 inches, and 140 parts per trillion in deeper soil, 1 to 6 inches. The TCDD values were 21 parts per trillion and 8.3 parts per trillion, respectively. As I stated, the sample, along with the other outliers greater than 100 parts per trillion TEQ, were collected on the public right-of-way, the roadside, and there were no residential locations in proximity to that location. So, to the viewer, that probably sounds like a foreign language, but I asked you about it. And first, let's discuss what they were testing. What is the TCDD values? What does that mean?
Well, dioxins, which are known to be highly toxic to humans and to animals, that's a class of chemicals, and there are such a broad number of those. They do not occur in nature. They are produced from fires. So when there is partial combustion, in other words, not complete combustion, in partial combustion, where you have lots of soot and ash that come off, as you did in East Palestine, then those chemicals known as dioxins are produced. And there are, as I said, there's a family of those, a broad number. It's not just one chemical, but TCDD, the one identified in Mark Durno's email, is the most toxic known dioxin. And dioxins have all kinds of different effects, chemical effects in our bodies. One of which is it can produce cancer, but it can produce cancer in a large number of different organs and organ systems in the body. And obviously, that's not something that occurs the day you're exposed. It's a delayed effect. And the question becomes then if you're exposed to enough. But one of the problems with dioxins is that when you inhale them, as would happen in the case of the fire, they stay in your body for years because they're stored in your bodies in body fat, and it just continues to recirculate. So it isn't something that you can breathe off or that can pass in your urine or feces and you're rid of the chemical eventually. It stays for a long time. It also stays for years in the environment. In some cases, it could be 15 years or 100 years, particularly if it gets into the subsoil, like Mark's email was talking about, the dioxins that are down at 6 inches, for example. It could be in that soil for 100 years. And the problem that it creates in the environment is that the area exposed, and Carly, I don't know, around you, is there farming communities around where you live?
Outside of Darlington, there are some independent farms, yes.
And you see, the problem is that EPA has also come out and said that there isn't dioxin contamination. So you don't have to worry about what you raise in your gardens. You don't have to worry about what you raise in your, on your farms. But we've actually developed data. Scott Smith is the chemist that took samples of garlic in East Palestine and identified that the levels of dioxins and furans and other closely related classic chemicals was very high in the garlic that was raised in the garden of these people that live in East Palestine. And so it's considered a forever chemical. It's highly toxic and very broad types of toxicity beyond just the cancer risk. And so the concern that I have as a toxicologist, several levels. One is that EPA is not being forthright in telling people about these hazards. In your case, I think, Carly, they tried to minimize it by saying it was taken, the samples were taken in the right of way. Can I ask you to confirm how far is your house from that right of way where they were taking the samples?
Well, I had said a mile. It's about a quarter of a mile, actually. It's between, my house in Darlington. It's a quarter of a mile, right outside my neighborhood.
Okay.
It's along right outside of my neighborhood.
And George, can I ask you, because I followed up with the EPA about that. I'm certainly not a toxicologist or a chemist, but it seems like through his language to her, he was trying to impress upon her not to worry because it's not actually, they didn't find it on your property. It was found on a quote roadside, but these are not chemicals that just stay static. And it just because they're not found on your property doesn't mean they don't move around the environment. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, it is correct, because for one thing, they can be transmitted through the water system in the soil. But more critically, in this particular case, is that these chemicals are highly reactive in the sense that they bind to particles, so they bind to soil particles. And when dust is created, then that soil is back in the air with dioxins attached to them. And a high degree of exposure from this apocalypse in East Palestine is the fact that you inhale these very toxic chemicals and they get into your body, and it's very long term for them to get out of your body.
And is this particular, because there are a lot of different types of dioxins, the TCDD that the EPA was telling Carly about, and I believe minimizing, in the scale of dioxins, how toxic is that?
Well, of the family of dioxins, which I think are around 400 different chemicals, it's considered, has long been considered, the most toxic. Wow. Of all the 400 known dioxins. And so it's a serious question. It's why independent scientists have focused on dioxins in sampling and testing the area around East Palestine. But where the email is trying to minimize concerns, and I can understand, I'm not trying to frighten Carly, but I am trying to give her information so that she can make informed decisions as to how to manage her health and her family. And you said, I think, Carly, that you have family that live with you? You have children, a husband?
I have 3 small boys and a husband, yes.
Okay, and your ages of your children are?
My oldest son is 9, and I have 6-year-old twins.
Okay, so you see, part of the concern that I have as a toxicologist is, first of all, you've experienced the overt symptom of losing your hair. And so you know that something has changed that. And there are, in fact, chemicals that can do that. I don't know specifically that the dioxin would be the chemical. But when you think about the fire in East Palestine, one of the frightening things to me as a toxicologist is that there were at least 200, maybe 400 chemicals released in that fire. And they're all in the air. So in my experience as a toxicologist for 5 decades now, over 5 decades, I have been evaluating one chemical and one effect. And so if you're exposed to a product and you have a reaction, then my job has been to try and figure out which of the chemicals in that product caused your reaction. In this particular case, it's not one chemical that was released into the environment. It was hundreds. And so to sort out of those hundreds of chemicals, some of which we may not even know, I've done research last year, actually in 2023, where I've identified at least 200 chemicals released. 120 of those can cause cancer. And EPA has failed to acknowledge the magnitude, the diversity of this exposure. In my 55 years of working in toxicology, this is the worst potential disaster I've ever seen. Nobody died, during that derailment and fire. And so it's been minimized and swept under the carpet that, well, then everything's okay. And EPA came out within a week or two and said, it's safe. You can come back. You don't have to be evacuated from your homes anymore. That announcement is what brought me out of retirement. And I've spent hundreds of hours now analyzing the situation from this fire because it has been so misrepresented.
And George, can I ask, because I don't want to get too in the weeds, but you have to when it comes to numbers. So he told her the TCDD values were 21 parts per trillion and 8.3 parts per trillion, respectively. He called them outliers, citing that they only found 6, quote, outlier samples out of 146 sites. Obviously, me citing those numbers mean nothing to viewers who have no expertise, but just looking at the doing some research, those seem like pretty high levels of the TCD dioxins that they found. And I don't really know why they're describing it as outliers. Sure, 6 out of 146 doesn't sound like a lot, but that's 4%. And frankly, based on the EPA's testing so far, there's a lot of flaws in their testing. So I don't even know if, you could fully trust. I don't know what they're testing with. I don't know how they're testing. So it's kind of hard to trust the competence of their testing. But can you just describe, and by the way, they did not want to test for dioxins. They had to be forced to test for dioxins by residents demanding it.
Right.
Are those high levels that I just described, 21 parts per trillion, 8.3 parts per trillion?
Yeah, they're very high levels, actually. But you come back to the question of outliers. There are 2 definitions of what an outlier is. If I take 140 samples, then I'm looking at the concentrations of those chemicals in the 140 samples. And an outlier could mean that 120 of them, there's very, very low levels, maybe not even detected chemical. And in 20 of them, then I'm detecting chemicals. That's one definition of an outlier. Another outlier is that I've detected it in 100 chemicals, 100 samples. I've detected TCDD, but these are the highest levels. And so the outlier becomes the magnitude of the amount that was found. So there are 2 different ways of looking at that. And the only way to know what he really meant by using that term outlier in his email is to see the data itself and know. But the point isn't whether it's an outlier or not, which he's tried to use as, if you will, a camouflage. But the levels are extremely high. And this is a very, very toxic chemical. And so a normal scientific process would be, if I found an outlier a quarter of a mile from her house, then I should have taken test samples closer to her house or in her house to see if there was TCDD there. It would be a focal point to see.
And Carly, I know that you've gone back and forth with the EPA. Tell us, did they test your house?
No, they did not. But I will say this public right-of-way, although it is along the roadside, it is somebody else's backyard. There are roads or a house on the other, up on the hill that it is somebody else's backyard, just because it might not be mine. It is somebody in my community's backyard, even though it's along the road. I've asked for lab reports, data, so I could go through and try to analyze what he meant by that. And they refused to give me lab reports and tell me what method they used to run these tests, because in order to understand the results, you need to know how they did the testing, and they will not give me that information.
Yeah.
And I want to ask both of you this first, Carly. So Joe, when you're a resident dealing with this, and this is all a foreign language to you, residents don't know what most of these terms mean. You have to kind of learn it yourself while wrangling 3 kids and life. Wouldn't you expect to have access to people like George from government agencies, experts who can break it down for you? It does not sound like that's what you've been getting.
No, I've had to teach myself everything I've had some people point me in the right direction and give me very useful information. But there has been nobody from a government agency to sit down and explain these results in layman's terms. It's been technical. So half the people, it sounds like they know what they're talking about, but really they're talking in circles and they're not really giving you any information. They're just saying big words to make you think that they know what they're talking about.
And just to be clear, because I reached out to the EPA, I'm not sure if they made these results public. If they did, it seems they have a pattern of burying them on their website where you can't find it. But they say, well, technically we made it public. So I don't know if they made these public, but as far as you know, when he provided you this link with this data, did he tell you that it was not public?
I had to ask for that several times before he actually gave it to me. And if you look at their website now, actually, it says about how there was some information that the public said they were holding back on the dioxin and furan. It's all on there. But that was new as well. But yeah, this wasn't given willingly. This had to be asked for over and over and over again.
And George, you've worked in government, outside of government. We know there's a pattern here because, I reported that they detected vinyl chloride and did not notify the public. With these levels, is this something the agency should have announced, should have reached out to nearby residents to do testing at their homes?
Well, not only should they have announced it, as I said before, they should have told Carly openly, and they should have told the neighbors. She just said some that are even closer to that testing area. But I'd like to point out another thing that's disturbed me a great deal, and that is that in this analysis, if you look at the levels that were found within the top 1 inch compared to the levels that were found 6 inches deep.
In the soil, you mean?
In the soil. They found the chemical in both samples, the ones that were deep soil samples and 1 inch samples, but they were many times higher on the surface. Now, I reemphasize, dioxins do not occur in nature. It's not a natural product from plants or animals or whatever. It's produced by burning things, organic things, made of carbon. And so when you see the data that says it's many times higher at 1 inch than it is at 6 inch, but it is at 6 inch, it's elevated at 6 inch. Where did it come from? It had to settle from the top where it's concentrated onto the surface of the ground and then worked into the surface at least 6 inches down. And what is the source it could have come from to be sprinkled all over the top at that very high concentration? And the logical source that EPA could figure out, I'm sure they did figure it out, is from the fire in East Palestine. It's not a surprise.
So I want to zero in on that because the EPA, as well as Norfolk Southern, in their testing, also Dr. Chip Carson, who, as we've reported here, is a supposed expert that was brought in shockingly by the actual plaintiff's attorneys. So attorneys that are supposed to represent the residents brought in a supposed medical expert who on his resume has worked for Chevron, Exxon, Enbridge, and Dow Chemical. And he basically said that the levels of contaminants, including dioxins, basically said that they're no different than the general levels that were already there before this because of, industrialization and et cetera. So it seems like there's been an effort to say the levels being found are already background levels that were already there. But these levels, like you're saying, are extremely high, particularly on the surface, so they couldn't have already been there.
That's absolutely correct. And the fact remains that the approach I've seen, first of all, I've seen a video from Dr. Carson, probably a 20 or 25-minute video that he made. And then he gave a presentation to a town hall meeting in East Palestine a month or so ago that was edited from that longer video. So it was short, maybe 2 or 3 minutes of it. And in that, he tries to use this idea that this part of Ohio is industrialized. But it's not industrialized with the ability to produce dioxins. Dioxins can only be produced by burning something. And that's not what's happened when you manufacture chemical products. So you're not going to have normal dioxins generated from chemical industry. And the other element that Dr. Carson has completely ignored, and I have serious questions whether he has disavowed his Hippocratic oath, because he's ignored all of the evidence that's around him that people are sick from this stuff. Not the least of which is Carly's loss of hair. And people, dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of people have had, well, let me put it differently. I've actually been provided a list of 95 different symptoms that have been compiled from people in this area. So rounding it off, let's say 100 different people have had these different symptoms. And this isn't because there's only one reason, and that is because of the train derailment and the fires. The rest, any background that was there, these people were exposed to them all their lives up until that accident. And now you have hundreds of people getting ill and can't even live in their homes because of what's residue there. Since the incident, that's not historic industrial operations that caused that. He knows that. He's smart enough to understand it with his medical toxicology background, but has chosen to misrepresent that. And so I find there's huge credibility problems with him. He's not looking objectively at the information.
And for historical context, these chemicals, I mean, other parts of America were actually cleared. People were evacuated. One in particular was in Times Beach, Missouri, when they found, I mean, it didn't happen right away, but when they found excessive levels of dioxins. So there is a historical precedent that people have been removed and evacuated from towns because of mass dioxin contamination.
Yeah, that's a very sad tale, because in Times Beach, Missouri, it took them almost 10 years to come to that realization and implement that program. But they literally closed the town. Everybody was evacuated, moved out, and people cannot live there in that town anymore. And in March of 2023, my recommendation that I put into an op-ed was to evacuate East Palestine for exactly the same reason. But I want to come back. In Times Beach, they evacuated the town, and the predominant, almost the only chemical that they were exposed to were dioxins. That's only one of the hundreds of chemicals that the people in this area have been exposed to. And President Biden decided that this isn't a major disaster. It's ludicrous under the, I've just recently reviewed the Stoffer Act, and this fulfills all the requirements of a Stoffer Act. He should have declared this a major disaster. It specifically allows for fires, floods, and explosions, which all occurred in East Palestine in that train derailment. And the language in the Stoffer Act says for any reason that there are fires, floods, or explosion. It's not natural disaster. It's for any reason that these occur that he can declare a major disaster area. So there are conversations among a number of us now to try and get that decision reversed and have it declared a major disaster area, and proper attention then to be focused. But the other element is the position, the geographic location of Carly and her family is downwind from East Palestine. And when I first got
we're talking over 7 miles from the derailment. Yeah.
But when I first got involved, I studied the news pictures of the plume. And one of them was taken from an airplane above the plume cloud, which had plateaued off at 3,000 feet because of a temperature inversion. And then it spread like a pancake over the communities. And that one photograph taken from an airplane shows the bottom portion of that suspended plume drifting what I presume is southeast. So my immediate concern within 2 weeks of this incident were the people in Pittsburgh, hundreds of thousands of people that would be exposed to that fallout.
Friday night, even before the vent and burn, the night of the actual derailment, that the news was picking it up on the weather radar in my area. You know what I mean? It looked like they couldn't tell whether it was rain or ash cloud.
Yeah, and I think that the uniqueness of this incident is the only term that I've come up with that can describe it is it's an apocalypse. It's more than a disaster. And the sad part is that the danger is in front of us, not behind us. It's
Right.
all of the things that we don't know are going to happen. And the comparison that I make is that when 9/11 happened, the shock to all of us was the 3,000 people that died that day. It's hardly reported at all that since then, there have been another 4,300 deaths, more than died on that day in the next 20 years. But there have been 71,000 people with serious illnesses from that day that haven't died yet. That's what's in front of the East Palestine operation. And I don't know how far it goes. Will it stop at Pittsburgh? Will it go all the way down to Washington, D.C.? Does it spread? There are people that complained at Niagara Falls, north of East Palestine, that the week of the burn in East Palestine, they suffered the exact same initial symptoms the people in East Palestine were suffering, with the headaches, the burning eyes, the skin irritation, etc. During that week, and when the burn stopped, their symptoms disappeared in Niagara Falls. So who knows what big area this could have encompassed.
And I just want to drill down, because I think this is the most important part. There is no scientific basis, George, for the EPA to be telling residents essentially, don't worry, we found this on a public road, so it doesn't affect you. That is not a thing, that if they found high levels of things like dioxins on a public road and not your private property, because he did tell her none of these samples were on private property, that doesn't mean there's no risk.
No, it doesn't, because I said it before. The fact that it's there on the surface, very high levels on the surface. Now that surface dries out and you have a strong wind that kicks up dust. It's not very far from that roadside to Carly's house or all of the neighborhood. And that's a major concern. And it's going to stay there for 15 to 100 years. It's not going to disappear. It's going to stay there.
And there are agricultural fields that produce soybeans and corn. They rotate every year, that gets sent to the masses. So this isn't just an East Palestine problem. I mean, these chemicals are known to uptake in vegetables, and and that soy could be used for infant formula for all we know. Like, it's concerning that they're not testing the produce coming from this area.
Carly, that you've really gotten yourself intelligent, because one of my big concerns is has this polluted the U.S. food chain?
And it's very possible from what I understand.
And again, these chemicals don't disappear from the soil for decades. So it isn't as though it's just a one-time harvest. And people are, I've not heard anything that the U.S. Department of Agriculture has evaluated the potential impact, because
I was there asking why they were not advising farmers to keep their cattle on stored grains until they got these results back, and they basically said it was safe and that it was okay and that I shouldn't worry about it.
Well, part of this, we hear a lot politically about misinformation campaigns, but the issues around the East Palestine apocalypse is all a misinformation
and Carly, I want to also make sure people understand. I mean, you've lost your hair, but you've had other health symptoms. We were just in East Palestine and Pennsylvania. I mean, we're talking to men with double breast cancer, pretty rare. Talking to women, there's a lot of menstrual cycle issues. There's been reproductive issues, menstrual cycle issues, periods going very long, periods just skipping for months at a time. Can you describe, both for yourself and people you know in the community, what are some of the issues people are having?
Well, starting in January, I had done just a poll by myself, and I've asked over 400 people, do you know anybody that has announced a pregnancy in the last 6 months? I had 3 people say yes out of over 400. That's uncommon for around here, especially right after Thanksgiving, Christmas. Everybody's always announcing babies. Nobody's getting pregnant right now. Nobody will give me, I've called the Department of Health and asked who's checking into this. Nobody is. But yeah, menstrual cycles, the girls that I work with, some of them have complained that their periods are heavy, or it's just their cramps are really bad. People that have endometriosis are having more symptoms, more cramping and things, usual acne breakouts, skin issues, dry skin, I mean, a lot of things. Older people getting dizzy, falling down. Everybody seems like they're going through cancer treatment. I don't know if it's just I'm noticing it more now that people are talking about it, but I feel like everybody I know is going through cancer treatment at the moment, and it's not they advertise either,
And you were diagnosed with alopecia, which is a hair loss issue. Did the doctor tell you that's common in people your age? I mean, you're in your 30s.
They told me many things can cause alopecia, which is true. Alopecia is a side effect of many different issues, but again, it was new for me. I'd never had any hair issues before this. So.
And George, the issues that you have been told about, not just from female residents, but many male residents, a lot of these are linked to the cancerous chemicals and the non-cancerous chemicals that were burned and detonated, correct?
Yeah, just taking the one chemical that everybody knows about was involved in this was vinyl chloride. Now, vinyl chloride is a known carcinogen, and it has many other toxicologic effects. But when you burn it, one of the primary products from it is hydrochloric acid, and it's in a vapor. And that goes into the air, and it gets bound to some of these particles that are going to settle out of the air. And what does hydrochloric acid do? It causes irritation to the eyes, the nose, the breathing system, skin irritation, and could very well be one of the contributors to Carly's alopecia because of its skin irritating, corrosive kinds of effects.
I had a question for George.
Yep.
Would UV light, would that alter or change any of these chemicals as well? Could it potentially?
Repeat your question. I didn't really hear it.
UV light, like from the sun, Could it alter or change these? I feel like sometimes when I go out in the sun, my head is irritated more. I don't know if that's just because it's burning because I don't have any hair, or I mean, it seems like the UV light from the sun irritates my skin.
Yes, and one of the things that can happen is that an irritant or corrosive chemical can sensitize you, and once you get sensitized, then lower exposure levels can precipitate that body reaction. And so the fact that your skin has been irritated from different chemical exposures, there are lots of irritants that were released in the plume, then that can sensitize you. In other words, you react to less, or to UV exposure, your reaction's more. And in some of us, I have very light skin and a exposed forehead. So my whole life, I've been conscious of being exposed to sunlight. But if I'm exposed, if I were living in East Palestine, there's a very high probability that I'm going to have greater sensitivity to the sun, even though I've had it all my life. And the other element of it is that with my light skin and normal exposure to sunlight, I have to be very conscious of skin cancer. In fact, I've had 2 or 3 different skin cancers removed from my skin in recent years. But the chemical exposure can accelerate that. There were chemicals in the products released by the fire that are known as cancer promoters. These are chemicals that don't cause cancer themselves, but when they're administered with chemicals that do cause cancer, the doses required to cause the cancer or the intensity of the cancers increases. So they promote other chemicals' ability to cause cancer. And those are all mixed in this stew. All of these things are mixed in the stew. And so it isn't just one chemical that you were exposed to, and we can say, oh, Carly, here's the chemical that caused your hair loss. It isn't that simple, because you were exposed to hundreds.
And George, looming over everything we discuss, we're obviously talking about, it sure seems like we're obviously talking about the EPA minimizing things, the EPA lying, the EPA, I believe, gaslighting residents. A lot of things that have been concealed, including CDC workers got sick in this area. We only learned about that through Freedom of Information requests. They didn't tell anyone that they left because they were sick. Workers, Norfolk Southern workers, have gotten sick that were on the emergency response. And hanging over all this is a settlement that could go through as early as this month, September. It's for $600 million. It's been a very complicated, convoluted process where residents don't really know the full details. Residents who wanted to opt in or opt out, it wasn't completely clear how to do that. Wasn't completely clear who you reach out to for that. But at the end of the day, it's certainly, in my experience, covering a lot of areas that have environmental calamities. I've never seen a settlement happen this quick. I believe $600 million is completely inadequate. There is not lifetime free healthcare or lifetime free testing, which I think residents are going to need on an ongoing basis. There's an open question. I don't know this for fact, but there has been some speculation that the $600 million figure might actually be Norfolk Southern's insurance policy. I don't know that for a fact, but that's what I've been told from a couple sources. A judge thus far has held up the settlement. There has been opposition to it, legal filings to stop it. The state of Pennsylvania is on the record that they are against this settlement in this form. But given everything we know, including this new information that the EPA, it seems, detected high levels of what you're describing as the most toxic form of dioxins, which would mean one of the most toxic chemicals, period, on Earth, and they didn't tell anyone or they didn't notify the wider public, What are your thoughts? Because we're up against the clock here in terms of this settlement possibly being finalized this month.
I wrote a 10-page submission to the court criticizing the settlement agreement and pointing out numerous scientific and technical errors that were not presented to the court. For example, I have no information that tells me that the court was understood that there are 8.5 million pounds of chemicals burned and put into the atmosphere. Just the magnitude of that number is mind-boggling to me, and is part of the reason that I say this has never occurred in the history all the time that I've been a toxicologist. But much of the information that the settlement, the scientific and medical information, was basically derived early in this incident. And in the last 6 months, in 2024, for example, 8 months, much information is accumulated, including the data that we're talking about here in Carly's neighborhood. EPA came out early on and said there are no dioxins. My calculations showed that there were dozens of products on that train that, when they were burned, produced dioxins. Two of the simplest examples were plastic pellets that were totally innocuous in the rail cars. No hazard to them at all. They're solids, you can handle them, you can touch them, they wouldn't have any toxicological effect. But when you burn them, they release 8 different materials that are carcinogenic. Innocuous materials. There was another train that had semolina in it. When I looked at that, I said, "What is semolina? I never heard of it." Turns out it's pizza flour. It's something we would eat, consume. What happens when you burn pizza flour? Because that car was burned, according to Norfolk Southern's manifest that I looked at. It produces the same kind of things that the plastic pellets produce, including toxins, when you burn it. And so I don't think that this information was presented to the court. So in my opposition statement, I included all of those reasons. And it's going to be of interest to me because of the variety of opinions that I know were submitted against it, including the state of Pennsylvania. I talked to the Attorney General's office there, that they argued against the settlement. Their primary argument is that they wanted more dollars. They didn't think the medical coverage was near enough, because much of the damage from health that occurs from this fire in East Palestine, Ohio, is immense in Pennsylvania. And so they objected to that comment. But I then submitted to the state of Pennsylvania, the Attorney General's office, my scientific criticisms of the information that was conveyed. So I think that, and also to emphasize the point that you made, where you were questioning the rapidity of the decision to get to the settlement agreement. In the town hall meeting that the attorneys representing the residents, they said multiple times, 3 or 4 different times, how proud they were that this is the fastest time anyone ever got to a settlement agreement of this magnitude. And I'm sitting there as a scientist saying, if people have been exposed now already for over a year, what difference does it make if you take a few more months and give it broader, more specific consideration? It's not what's in the best interest of the citizens to rush into a settlement. It is in the best interest of the law firms, because I've been told specifically by attorneys that of the $600 million in the settlement, the attorneys are going to receive $167 million. So almost a third. And to my mind, I know that's I'm an expert witness. I've been an expert witness in 56 lawsuits. I know that percentage is not unusual. It's typically 25 to 33% that ends up for attorneys. But in this particular case, that hasn't been publicized to the public. 600 billion sounds like a lot of money. But if I'm in a law firm and I'm looking at $167 million, that's a lot more money to my revenue stream than the monies that trickle down to the individual families. And some of the families have said that in their calculations, they might be lucky to see $200 to $700 for all that they're gone through. And so this is mismanaged, miscommunicated, and the science in it has been badly represented.
And also, you could get as many dollars as possible, but if you get cancer, other life-threatening illnesses, unless you just have blanket free health care, which I do not believe this settlement provides, I mean, those bills, even with insurance, can quite possibly far exceed what you get out of this settlement. Is that correct?
It absolutely is. In fact, one of the provisions in the settlement, as I've been told, says that Norfolk Southern has to pay in this settlement, in the $600 million, is $25 million for medical treatments, long-term, future medical complaints. But there's no renewal. Once the $25 million is used up, they don't have to replenish it. Or it is their choice whether they choose to replace it or not. And so think of it in this term. $600 million to you and me sounds like a lot of money. And it is. But we're talking about a company. Norfolk Southern is a company that's $12 billion a year in revenue. 600 million. This is going to be spent over years to come. Let's say over 10 years. So if it were 60 million a year that they have to spend, they'll never see that affect the $12 billion a year in revenue they're going to see. It's a drop in the bucket. So this settlement has grossly protected Norfolk Southern. And for people that go and claim the monies from Norfolk Southern, there are provisions in this settlement that forbid them from filing other claims. They have to sign agreements. And it's just a sad situation. I was thinking last night, the Environmental Protection Agency, in its name, is supposed to protect our environment. And the reason that agency was set up decades ago was to protect our health too, so that the environment is protected. So these high levels of dioxin that are outside of Carly's home, you would think that somebody in the Environmental Protection Agency would be figuring out, how do I clean that up so that she's not exposed to it? And they're basically saying, well, it was near the road and it wasn't right at your house or on your property, and so I'm going to ignore it. Where is the protection part in EPA's title? And who they're protecting here is Norfolk Southern.
Carly, as we end, let me ask you, I think one of my frustrations as a journalist is it's very hard to, most people in today's America and with so much information coming at you have a hard time remembering something that happened 10 days ago, let alone, a year and a half ago, even something as catastrophic as this. Obviously, right now, the media's focus is the presidential election, Senate, Congress, all that. Who's up, who's down, polls. But here you have a toxicologist, half a century, a half a century of experience calling this an apocalypse. For you, you're feeling it. I mean, you're a young woman, you've lost your hair, other health problems, your whole community in Pennsylvania and crossing the border into Ohio. We're not talking about a few people. We're talking about hundreds, if not more, having serious health problems, strokes, seizures, body tingling, people urinating blood. I've talked to, pooping blood, cancers already. And it seems that it is essentially being swept under the soil. No pun intended.
Yeah.
How does that feel? Because it's got to be both infuriating and alarming that the more time that goes by, the more, that's kind of normalized.
I was upset at first, I was sad, and now I'm just pissed off. I'm angry. I refuse to watch everybody in my community, kids get sick and, just blame God for it whenever we know who to blame. Like, I refuse to just sit back and watch people struggle to get pregnant or have babies born with issues and blame themselves and wonder what they did and blame God and, and something, it's not fair that they are not being transparent with this information. And I will keep pointing out their faults and what they're doing wrong from what I've been able to teach myself and understand it in a way, and try to just keep telling people in my community about it, that it's not right. And I hope this settlement is not just either. It just leaves so many questions unanswered still, and it defers blame, and it's infuriating.
And George, any parting thoughts on what people should know and the magnitude of this?
I have met a lot of wonderful people in East Palestine now as a result of this and my peripheral involvement. And I'm impressed. Carly is a living example. Here is a woman who has learned complicated science and medicine on her own to protect her family. And to my mind, that's a huge source of pride in the spirit of humanity. And one of the things that's being talked about regularly now is how do we organize all of these people so that their voice is magnified. And there is a group in East Palestine now that I've found recently, only a few weeks ago, called Justice for East Palestine Residents and Workers. That is, I'm going to have a meeting at noon today to talk about the strategies that can be implemented to get the president's decision reversed, to get this settlement agreement at least postponed, and to try and raise funds to help families that are struggling so badly. I mean, there are people not living in their homes any longer in East Palestine, and they're running out of money. And winter's coming. They're going to be homeless. And what can we do to raise funds to help these people? So this is a struggle, I think, for us to determine who are the good Samaritans that are going to take care of the injured at our own expense, in our own time, and our own resources, such as this video that you're making, Jordan. That this is our opportunity to step up and prove that we can be the good Samaritans, and that the nation needs to get behind this.
I thank you both so much too. That there's been times where I just thought, what's the point, and I wanted to quit. And it's people like you though that help me stay on my feet and keep me going, and that means a lot to me. Both of you, thank you.
And I think it's very important, Carly, that in my experience, most people, whether it doesn't matter what you are politically, conservative, liberal, libertarian, whatever, most people, when they learn that Flint still has bad water 10 years later, are outraged. Yeah. The problem is most people don't know because the media is failing them. And it's the same circumstance here. most people, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. People live busy lives, so they just have no way of knowing that this is still such a disaster. But when they learn of it, they're outraged and they want to help you and others. So really the battle is, it's an information war and trying to get the word out. And, you know, George is doing it in the scientific way. I'm doing it in the journalistic way, but we will stay on it. So I appreciate both of you for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you to both of you.
All right. Have a great one.